Welcome and good afternoon. I'm your host, Gregory Saxton, professor of accounting at the Schulich School of Business and co-director of Schulich's Center in Digital Financial Information. Thank you for your patience. We had a little bit of technical difficulties, but now we're good to go. I'm happy to say we're generously supported by CPA Ontario, and we're excited to bring you another webinar today by Dr. Andrea Kelton on robotic process automation in accounting. Dr. Kelton is a professor of accounting in the Jennings A. Jones College of Business at Middle Tennessee State University, and hopefully I'm saying this right, Murfreesboro, Tennessee, and has been a professor of accounting at Wake Forest University and the University of South Florida. She was an assurance senior associate at KPMG and received her PhD in accounting from the University of Tennessee. She's published in a lot of high impact accounting and business journals, and I'm delighted to welcome her again today. So thank you, Andrea, for joining us, and I will pass this stage off to you.
Thank you, Greg. Appreciate so much the invitation to be here with everybody. Still morning here where I am in Tennessee, but this afternoon probably for several of you. As Greg mentioned, I'm a professor of accounting at MTSU, which, yes, it's in Murfreesboro, which is about 30 miles outside of Nashville, Tennessee, in the U.S. My first career, as he mentioned, I worked in audit at KPMG, and I left that first career in 2002, which was important because that is the year that the Sarbanes-Oxley Act was passed in the United States, which drastically changed the audit profession and business in general. But relative to our talk today, that was also the year that KPMG started rolling out electronic work paper systems. I'm that old, but that really made a lasting impression on me because I got to witness firsthand how the implementation of new technologies impacts people and processes in the audit profession. And so now that I'm in my second career, which is academics, I spend most of my time thinking about this issue, which is teaching and talking about topics at the intersection of information technology and accounting. And my focus and my interest really is on how do people change and adapt, and how do technologies change the way we see the accounting profession. So I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak with you all today about one such technology, which is robotic process automation. I hope to cover three broad topics during our time today. First, I'll spend some time talking about exactly what is robotic process automation. I'll show you a quick example, a screenshot of a bot I built to automate a simple task. And we'll talk about some of the major players in this space in terms of RPA providers. Second, when talking about technologies and automation in the accounting profession, I'd be remiss if I didn't address this second point, which I think's been a lot of folks' minds for the last 10 to 15 years. And that is, are robots taking over the accounting profession? Spoiler alert, no, they certainly are not. But I think diving into this question helps us understand a little bit the benefit of automation and specifically RPA, really understanding why people have this notion that bots are going to take over accounting. And then finally, hopefully after our conversations, you're going to start brainstorming about some ways you can implement bots in either your personal or your professional lives. So I'll offer, as we conclude, some best practices to think about as you're automating processes and tasks. First point, what is robotic process automation? So robotic process automation, or RPA, as I'll refer to it, is the use of low-code software programs to automate mundane, repetitive, routine business processes and tasks. Now, there are a couple things about RPA that make it unique relative to other technologies and automations. First, this idea that RPA is low code. And what I mean by that is that instead of having to write lines of code to build a bot, which would require accountants to be proficient in programming and coding skills, RPA allows users to leverage visual interfaces, drag and drop functionality, and oftentimes pre-built components, excuse me, to build bots and automate tasks. And I'll show you an example of this soon, just about what I mean by low code and how easy it is to build a bot. Second unique nature about RPA is that it's built to be accessible. And what that means is RPA really enables citizen developers to participate in the automation process. And this is important and probably one of the main reasons why we've seen this high speed growth of RPA in accounting, as these citizen developers are the individuals that usually best know what tasks are good candidates for automation. And that's as compared to the IT folks who may really understand the programming and the coding and the application, but maybe don't have a good understanding on the business process. So RPA is accessible, meaning those citizen developers can really drive and participate in the automation process. So before I go much further in terms of talking about RPA, I'll take a quick pause to talk about the difference between RPA and artificial intelligence. AI is on everybody's mind. We can't escape it. But in brief, they're not the same. RPA is really focused on automating routine, repetitive, rule-based tasks, while AI is primarily built to simulate human intelligence, to handle more complex tasks and make decisions. I read just the other day, an expert summed up the difference by saying RPA mimics human actions, while AI mimics human thinking. Now, certainly you can use artificial intelligence to build a bot, but these two technologies have very different purposes within an organization. So I want to show you a quick example of a bot I built, just to kind of understand what I mean by bot, automation, user friendliness, etc. So this is a screenshot of a bot I built using UiPath, which is one of the leading RPA providers. So this task, let's say I have a list of companies that I'm investing in, and it's important for me to stay up to date on their earnings announcements and filings with the Securities and Exchange Commissions. So that task would normally require that on a periodic basis, I go out to the SEC's EDGAR website, search for the company, scroll through all the list of the filings to see, what new have these companies reported lately. That's routine task, that's a mundane task, that's a time-intensive task that is a perfect candidate for automation. So what I did is I built a bot to do that for me. And so this bot will first go to an Excel worksheet that I've created that lists all the companies I've invested in, and it'll loop through that data, and then it will go to the SEC EDGAR website for each company. And I've created to copy and paste the URL of the newest 5 filings for each company, and then copy that data into a brand new worksheet in that Excel workbook. So that obviously saves me a lot of time that I don't have to go out to the SEC website, scroll, scrape, copy, paste, etc. So I want to talk a little bit about the functionality here of UiPath. Like most RPA applications, UiPath has a set of activities built in that gives you that drag and drop functionality. Again, making it low code. And you can see that on the left, the list of activities that are standard in UiPath. And it's built to work with a variety of applications. So you can see there are some specific Excel functions. You can see it has use your browser. It's got functionality for Word, Adobe Acrobat, you name it. And then you find the activity you want, and then you just drag it there to the middle to create your bot or your workflow. And so you really build this sequentially, as you would think like a flow chart or a process diagram, in terms of what order these steps need to be performed by the bot. What's great about RPA is that every bot you build has its own project folder, and you can see that in the ribbon up in the top. And this is where you store any data that the bot needs to operate. So in this example, I've got an Excel workbook of companies that I'm invested in. I just drop that into the project notebook for UiPath to access. And that's where it reads the data. And then that's also where it writes to the data once it scrapes the data from the SEC's website. This is beneficial because when the data changes, so let's say I sell an investment, I'm no longer interested in a company, or I buy a new investment, I'm adding a company, I don't have to change anything in the bot. I don't have to rerun any formulas. I just have to update the data in the project notebook. So very user-friendly interface. And again, an example of a task that would be good for automation. I mentioned UiPath, but I wanted to tell you about some of the other major players in the RPA space. This is Gartner's 2024 report on RPA vendors. UiPath, Automation Anywhere, the ones I have the most experience with. But I want to mention a couple others that are not on this list, primarily because they're not considered true or pure RPA vendors. First is Tableau Prep. Tableau, which most of you are probably familiar with, is a visualization software. They also have a product called Tableau Prep, which is primarily used for ETL activities, that is extracting, transforming, loading data, cleaning up your data for analysis. But although Prep's not built primarily for RPA, it can be very helpful for automation and building kind of automated tools. And I'll tell you about an example of that in just a minute. Alteryx is another tool that can be useful for building bots and automating tasks. Alteryx also is primarily an ETL application, but the user-friendly interface and the fact that many tasks that we want to automate are ETL in nature makes Alteryx a good candidate for that. And knowing about these two can be helpful because it might also keep your organization from having to invest in multiple applications for different purposes. So the question I want to address, now that we have a little bit of understanding of automation, what RPA is, and have seen an example of a task that could be automated, you can probably start to think about why this concern exists in the market. And this concern that, all right, if we can automate all these tasks, why do we actually need human accountants? And so I want to spend some time talking about this issue a little bit. So this concern really came from a 2013 survey that investigated jobs across multiple industries and to identify perceptions that whether or not these jobs were going to be automated. At the time, it said probability of computerization. And as you can see from this chart on the right, accountants and auditors were at the top of that list. And this survey reported that there was a 94% chance that accountants and auditors were going to be replaced by automation. You had a similar study that you can see on the left, this one conducted by the University of Oxford. looking at the top 10 jobs likely to be automated. And you can see tax preparers were there in that list of the top 10 jobs that were likely to be automated. So when these surveys started to be released and these easy to use RPA applications were being pushed out to the market, we can start to understand why the profession started to panic a little bit and why folks started to believe that we weren't going to need human accountants anymore. And I'll tell you from personal experience, this concern even spilled over to college campuses. When I first came to MTSU about 10 years ago, I was hired to develop analytics curriculum in our accounting programs. And through that process, I was meeting with the department chair from our information systems department here in the College of Business. And when I was talking about these new courses to this gentleman, he looked at me in all seriousness and said, "What's the point of all this? Why are you doing all this? Accountants are only going to be replaced by robots anyways." So now he was wrong. I rolled out these courses, and in fact, our accounting programs have grown. Our enrollments are up. But that just signals this misunderstanding in the marketplace of accountants and whether or not these bots were going to replace our jobs. And so why do you think people did have this notion? And I'll argue that it's basically due to the stereotype that exists about accountants and what we do. And so when you think about this next survey, that really helps us understand, it helps us realize that, in fact, there are a lot of things that accountants do that are good candidates for automation. This was a survey conducted by SAP, and they surveyed finance and accounting professionals across the globe to understand where they were using automation in their businesses. And these were some of the most common finance and accounting related tasks that had already been automated. So if you look at these tasks, what do they have in common? So we've got invoice management, purchase order management, expense management, etc. So these are tasks that are traditionally pretty routine, traditionally pretty manual intensive, a lot of data entry, copy and paste, collecting data from different places. These tasks are typically pretty standardized, not a lot of variation in the process. And these are tasks that are repeatable, meaning they typically take place over and over and over again. So you can see why folks might have started to think about accountants being replaced by robots, because these are the tasks we traditionally have performed, and they are very good candidates for automation. But here's the good news for accounting. And I think it's good news because it helps us see where automation, where RPA is actually going to be value add to our own jobs and to the profession at large. So my experience has been that the individuals that are talking the loudest about how accountants are going to be replaced by robots or even by artificial intelligence are usually those that know the least about what accountants actually do in our jobs. And that experience is supported by this survey that was put out by McKinsey. And they surveyed finance leaders on what specific tasks can and cannot be automated. So on the right, the bluish or the bluish green hues represent the tasks that are highly automatable or fully automatable. So similar to what we saw previously, these are your routine, repeatable, low complex tasks. But the good news for accountants is what's on the left. The yellow and green hues represent those tasks that are either somewhat automatable or difficult to automate. Now, this is probably not surprising to any of us. We all are aware of the value proposition of accounting professionals. So although accounting historically has involved manual, repeatable, routine tasks, this stereotype of accounting, and those tasks are good candidates for automation, that's really not the case anymore. And so, what accountants are really good at and where we thrive are these tasks on the left, the yellow and the green hues, those that require critical thinking, judgment, professional skepticism, and those tasks cannot be replaced by bots. And so I think this really points to the good news for our profession, and not that bots are replacing our jobs, but that RPA is allowing us to spend more time on different tasks, these tasks in the yellow and green that are a little bit more value add to our organizations, because we can use bots, we can use RPA to automate those tasks in the blue and the green hues on the right. So just last piece of good news. I'm really big on busting this myth about the bots and AI coming for our jobs, especially on a college campus where I'm talking to students and trying to advise them with their careers. This was the report put out by the United States Bureau of Labor Statistics. They put out employment projections. And as you can see, accountants and auditors are expected to grow by 6% over the next 10 years, which is higher than the average of all occupations. So last little bit of good news there about bots are not taking over our jobs. All right, so now that we feel pretty good that bots are going to be beneficial and not replace us, but actually support us in our day-to-day activities as accountants, let's talk about the various ways that RPA is having an impact on accounting and the profession. So this data is from an academic study published a couple years ago, and the authors conducted interviews at auditors at a Big Four firm. And what's important to note is that the authors interviewed folks on both ends of the organizational charts. They talked to individuals that were considered RPA leaders in the firm. And then they also talked to lower level staff members in the firm. So they got a very broad perspective on how RPA is impacting their jobs in Big Four firms. So this was mainly focused on the audit profession. And in their interviews, the authors of this study came to four big conclusions, or four big ways, themes that were repeated in the interviews on how RPA is impacting the profession. First, consistent with the data that we just previously saw, RPA is changing the work accountants perform. It's removing the mundane tasks through automation. We're allowing the bots to do those tasks, and it's freeing up more resources to spend on more value-added tasks, those tasks that involve analytics, critical thinking, professional skepticism, judgment, and decision-making. Second major theme. Given this shift in focus on more value-added jobs or value-added tasks, accountants are developing new skill sets, things like analytic mindset, developing client relationships. And these skills are opening up new opportunities for accountants in these Big Four firms. And as a result, it's increasing job satisfaction and reducing employee turnover. Third, similarly, with this change in role and building of skill sets, it's opening up new career prospects within the firms, which is providing a positive impact on the overall attractiveness of the profession. So it's allowing us to be more appealing to students on our campus about the opportunities with an accounting major and a career in accounting. And then the fourth theme that came out from these surveys, consistent with my previous conclusion, is that RPA will not result in reduced hiring. And so both RPA leaders and the staff level accountants both felt very confident that it was not going to have a negative impact on their job. So these are just some quotes from this survey that I think are telling and really highlight the possibility and the opportunity that RPA provides. This first quote, it's made jobs easier, allowed people to focus on more value-driven work. You've got more time to focus on reviewing the tax return, thinking of creating ideas to help the client. So there was a lot of conversation in the article, a lot of data gathered about focusing more on client service and being value add to the client because you've automated some of those routine and repetitive tasks. Second comment, a lot of the people don't like the mundane. It's not exciting. Everybody's talking about how we're going to fire 50% of our people because of the bots, but it's the exact opposite. We're going to use them to do more value added work. Third quote, as I mentioned, they think it's going to reduce turnover. And then the last quote, which really speaks to developing those new skills, it's allowed me to focus on client relationships and interpreting data rather than on mundane tasks. And that was a quote from one of the staff accountants who traditionally have been charged with the mundane tasks, but now they're focusing on developing those new skills. So hopefully I've convinced you not to be afraid of the bots, but instead to think about how RPA could improve both your personal and professional lives, and to see the potential positive impact that it can have on our profession, excuse me. But like with most technologies and innovations, in order for RPA to be beneficial, it has to be done right within your organization. So I'll next offer some best practices in robotic process automation, focusing on two primary themes. First, you want to make sure you're automating the right process. And second, make sure that you are managing the risks associated with the use and implementation of RPA. Let's first talk about how to decide what to automate and what to consider a good candidate for automation. So an academic study, Ulrich et al. In 2002 did case studies of organizations that were implementing RPA to automate some tasks and came to some consensus about the task attributes that would make a task a good candidate for automation. And so these are the suggested attributes that you should look for when you're scanning your business process to think about where could you implement a bot. First attribute, you want to find tasks that operate in a stable environment. And so what I mean by that is you want to look for your more mature business processes and those processes that do not change frequently. And that would be a good candidate for a bot. Second, you want to identify tasks that are rule-based, processes that follow some pre-specified steps. Think about that if-then logic that we often use when performing business processes. And those tasks that really don't require a lot of human judgment. Again, it's that if-then logic. Those tasks are good candidates for automation. Third, you want to use low complexity tasks for automation. You want processes that typically have a limited number of exceptions and rely on a small number of data sources. Bots are most effective with low complex tasks. Fourth, think about your tasks that have a high volume of transactions. Processes that occur frequently. When you're thinking about automation, you're thinking about how can I save time? And when you identify those high volumes, those tasks that have high volumes of transactions, those are very good candidates for automation. Fifth, you want to focus on tasks that have structured data versus unstructured data. So structured data, you're thinking about organized text and numbers. Unstructured data, you're thinking about pictures, videos, audio files, etc. Bots will work better on structured data just due to the complexity and the variability that's involved with the use of unstructured data. Sixth, you want to identify tasks that are repetitive, the process that occur the same way and often feel like it's happening over and over and over again. Again, if we're trying to automate for efficiencies, these are the tasks that you can typically benefit the most from with automation. 7, find tasks that access multiple systems or processes that require you to interface with multiple software programs. Like the example in UiPath that I showed you previously, I had to open up an Excel file, find my list of investment companies, go to the SEC website, search within that website, go back to Excel. Those are time intensive tasks that the bot can automate and with save you some time and efficiencies. So if you have to access multiple systems, that would be a good task for automation. 8, you want to think about tasks where you have a clear understanding of manual costs. When you're thinking about automation, certainly you're going to balance the benefits and the costs of implementing some bot into your organization. So you want to make sure it's easy to understand and document the time typically involved in performing that task so you can document and analyze your time savings. 9th, digital data. Obviously, if we're dealing with applications and working in something like UiPath, you need tasks that are 100% digitized, not real good working with hard copy of vendor invoices. So any tasks with digital data. And then finally, you want to think about your tasks that typically have a high error rate. Humans, we are really good at making unintentional mistakes, which obviously are costly to our organizations. So you want to identify those tasks, which ones are prone to human error, typically from data entry. And those are tasks that could really benefit from the use of bots and automation. So hopefully these 10 attributes give you some guidelines for thinking about tasks that you're involved in, again, in both your personal and your professional lives, and giving you some guidelines to evaluate those tasks in terms of which would be good candidates for automation. Next, I want to provide you some specific use cases. So think about some specific ways that organizations are deploying bots to automate tasks within the organizations. First way, which is pretty common, is using bots for sales order processing. And so once the process is triggered by a request from a customer, the bots are automatically creating the sales orders, updating inventory information, and preparing and disseminating sales invoices to the interested parties. So again, a repeatable task, probably got a high number of transactions, pretty manual intensive, pretty much follow standard rules in an if-then kind of process. So a good task for automation. Second, RPA is being used to help organizations manage their inventory. So to perform tasks such as tracking the inventory levels, automatically notifying purchasing managers when you have low stock, and even building in rules where you can monitor production and processes for defects. Again, if you have specific rules that you can put into the bot where the managers are automatically notified if you exceed some type of exception threshold. Good candidate for automation and using a bot. Third, fraud detection. This is an area that has grown quite a bit in terms of its use of RPA, because you're thinking about scanning huge amounts of data from multiple sources to try to identify anomalies or red flag of fraud. And bots can be very good at that in terms of consistently following these rules for identifying anomalies and also wading through huge amounts of data. So performing tests like comparing transactions to approval limits or approved contract amounts, and even comparing bank details to identify anything suspicious that might be a red flag for a vendor or some type of payroll fraud, excuse me. So a lot of opportunities for fraud detection when it comes to RPA. And then finally, think about all the data collection and data management you do on a day-to-day basis. So similar to the example I showed you where I scrape data from the SEC website, you can build a bot to do that data collection for you. So think about anytime you've had to go out to gather data about current historical stock prices, foreign currency rates, interest rates, et cetera. That data changes frequently and it's time intensive to go find the data as of a certain date. Then there's also that risk of human error that we might look at the wrong information or mistype the information into our Excel workbook. So all of these attributes make data collection a good candidate for RPA. Excuse me. So this is an actual LinkedIn post from one of my former students who's still a student here, hasn't quite finished her accounting degree. But I share with you as just another example of how organizations are using RPA, but also about how user-friendly these applications are. So this was a student, she was in my undergraduate accounting systems class, and then she worked over the summer as an intern for Nissan. Nissan has a pretty big presence here close to our university. And her entire internship was spent on working on one project. And that project was automating a tax calculation for Nissan. And she reported in this LinkedIn post that previously the tax calculation was done in Excel, and it took the team about a day, an entire day, every quarter to make that tax calculation. But after she created this automation, it now only takes an hour a quarter to finish that tax calculation. And she created this automation using Tableau Prep, which I mentioned to you previously. And again, a great example, great anecdote of context that you can start to think about where things can be automated and the real time savings that these bots can offer to your organizations. To go from an entire day every quarter to an hour is quite remarkable for a tax calculation. And I will say too, this student had experience with Tableau, with creating visualizations in Tableau, but did not have any experience with Tableau Prep before starting this internship. And I share that with you, again, just to reiterate how user-friendly these these RPA applications are. She obviously had a very good handle on the business process, so she made a very good citizen developer and was able to easily understand and learn Tableau Prep to help the tax team save time. I teach RPA in my graduate accounting analytics class. So I wanted to give you some more examples of different ways that you can use RPA, again, in both your professional and your personal lives. I give my students assignment. I say, find a task and automate it. I keep it ambiguous intentionally because I want them to really think about identifying the tasks. I think that's one of the most important parts of this process of automation. The tech's easy. But what's important, particularly for accountants, is making sure we understand these attributes of tasks and we really think about how automation will impact our lives. So these are 3 examples I just wanted to share with you today. First, a student group created a bot that automatically sends out happy birthday emails to employees. So they created a fictitious list of employees, in an Excel workbook, so names, addresses, birth dates, etc. And so what the bot will do every day is scroll through that employee list in Excel, compare the birth date to the day, and then for employees whose birthdays are today, will automatically, open up Microsoft Outlook, draft an email to that employee, and send it, wishing them happy birthday. So I thought that was a really creative example of how to automate a task, an important task, but one that could certainly free up some time by letting a bot do that. Second, we had a student group that created a bot to track the price of eggs. So this class was in the spring. And so in the United States, we were talking quite a bit about the price of eggs in the United States. And so they built a bot that went out to the websites of 4 prominent grocery stores in the United States, found the price of eggs that week, copy and pasted the price from the website into an Excel worksheet, and then automatically calculated median, average, min, max price of eggs for that week. So I thought that was a pretty creative way to automate a task that, again, could be kind of manually intensive and involves going to different data sources. Third, I had a student group that created a bot that pre-populated data into a fillable Adobe Acrobat PDF form. So this was, I believe it was some employee contract or employee agreement form that had to be filed and sent for every employee in the organization. So the bot circled through that Excel worksheet that had all the employee data, found the correct data, the correct fields, and copied that from the Excel workbook for each record, for each employee, and then copied it into the appropriate place in the PDF. And then once it was complete for one employee, it saved it and attached it to an email and sent it to that employee. So another example of, again, a time-intensive task, pretty manually intensive, and something that would be a very good candidate for automation. So again, just wanted to show you some additional examples, things that some of my students came up with to help you in brainstorming some ways that you can use automation in your personal and professional lives. So hopefully you're thinking about these different ways, but as accountants, when we think about automation, when we think about implementing technology, we need to think about risks. And so, like with all IT, RPA comes with risks. So when you're thinking about deploying bots or creating bots, it's important to think about these risks a priori so you can address the risks while you're creating the bots and rolling them out within your organizations. So a study was conducted to identify what some of the primary risks organizations are facing as they implement RPA throughout their organizations. And so this study, they interviewed 26 what they call key RPA stakeholders, and this was at a large Fortune 500 company in the United States, to get a better understanding of some of the challenges and pitfalls they faced while deploying RPA in the organization. And then to validate those results, these academics also were able to talk to the Fortune 500 company's auditors to see if they had consistent ideas. But then they also interviewed chief audit executives and IT audit specialists at a variety of firms, again, just to validate the results from the interview. And through this process, they identified 5 key risks of RPA. So next, I want to talk about each of these in a little bit of detail. First risk associated with RPA. Sometimes RPA can be used as a quick fix to a business process. So think of it like a Band-Aid, instead of fixing the core problems with your business process. And so instead of immediately building a bot, it's important to take a step back and really think about the business process first, and to consider whether or not what you really need is to re-engineer that process and not necessarily automate it. Because if you automate a bad task, it's still a bad task. It's just done much faster. And this is a quote from one of the interviews that really supports that notion. Second risk associated with RPA. RPA can really lead to additional internal control and security problems. And there are a couple primary concerns when it comes to internal control. First, there runs a risk that there are uncontrolled and unknown bots. Since these bots are often citizen developed, sometimes there's not a good organization-wide inventory that the bots that have been deployed. And the first quote on the slide here really speaks to that. Since it's so easy to generate a bot, it's not that easy to know where it was created and with what technology. So having those unknown and uncontrolled bots can be a risk to internal control. Second, internal control concern. There's a risk that there's a failure to assess bot risk at the organizational level. And the second quote kind of speaks to this issue. So you might be involved in a very focused business process, understand there's a need for automation, roll out the bot, but you do that without taking a step back and thinking of organization-wide implications, such as what are the assurance-related implications of this? Do we need to have now additional internal controls somewhere else because we rolled out this bot to automate this process? So you need to make sure you think about bot risk at an organizational level when it comes to internal controls. Third risk, excuse me, fraudulent bot activities. So in order for these bots to work, they have to be given system access rights and privileges. And so what we're inevitably doing is just giving fraudsters and hackers another way to gain access into our systems. So these bots can unintentionally allow for more opportunities for fraudulent or questionable activities. And there's an example of this in a recent academic study. They looked at the impact of RPA usage on earnings management at Taiwanese companies. And what this study found that firms that use RPA had an increase in both their accruals earnings management and their real earnings management activities relative to firms that did not use RPA. And the conclusion of that was that because of the enhanced use of RPA, there were fewer internal controls over data and financial reporting, which allowed for the opportunity for earnings management. And then the final internal control risk, there's always a risk that bots are going to provide bad data. Bots are going to do exactly what you tell it to do. So you need to make sure that there are controls in place over the actual programming, and then thinking about additional deductive controls to identify whether there is bad data. Third risk associated with the use of RPA, excuse me. Most in the industry believe that the true costs of RPA are underestimated and misunderstood. And the reason for this is that it's easy to identify the savings in labor hours and reduced errors, but what most underestimate or don't identify are the recurring costs related to enhanced monitoring, additional security measures that are necessary to support the bots. And so the costs of RPA can be sometimes more than the benefits if we don't truly estimate the cost of all those additional security measures. And that's what this quote alludes to. Fourth risk associated with RPA, governance. Most find RPA governance to be complicated and challenging because you have to strike a balance, which this quote alludes to. So on one hand, you want to have a governance structure that allows the autonomy and ability for citizen developers to be involved in the automation process, but you got to balance that with the assurances and controls that come from a more centralized RPA environment. So it's difficult to govern the environment to reach that balance and still have a decent level of risk management. And again, this is because it's low code, it's user friendly, so it's difficult to manage. It's different from managing other applications. And then the final risk associated with RPA use is that it can lead to a loss of process knowledge within your organization. And this is primarily due, again, to the use of citizen developers. And you can find this in two primary ways. First, there can be a loss of domain knowledge regarding the underlying business process, because as bots start performing these processes and humans stop performing them, we lose the ability to understand the process or even to perform it without the support from the bot. So we become so overly dependent on the bot, we lose that underlying knowledge of the process. And then the second point related to knowledge loss is that we can lose the knowledge of the bot and what it's doing if that citizen developer actually leaves the organization. So this is another key reason why documentation of the bots and having an organization-wide inventory is so important, so we don't have that knowledge loss should we lose the citizen developer. So thinking about those 5 primary risks and how you can best protect your organization, the authors offer a governance framework and specifically 4 major areas to consider as you're implementing RPA in your organization. And the 4 areas are bot usage decision. Think about what processes you're automating, who has authority, and how you're going to implement them. Second, access and authorization management. So not only who has access to create the bot, but what access you're giving the bot is an important concern to consider. Third, managing process changes. So how does the bot change the process? Does the process need to change? Do we need to change the bot? Making sure you have controls in place over those issues. And then finally, overall IT operations. As I mentioned, if you're giving the bot access, you're giving something else security rights. And so making sure you think about the entire IT infrastructure and how it will be impacted through rolling out your bots. So that really wraps up the thoughts I wanted to share with you today about RPA. What is it? How it's positively impacting the profession. So to conclude, they are not coming for our jobs. So hopefully if you had heard that before or had that concern, whether it's through RPA or AI, my personal professional opinion is no, they will not replace our jobs. Because as we've seen, there are many things that accountants do that cannot be replaced with technology. But instead, we can really lean into automation and rely on RPA to free up resources, save us some time, so that we can spend that time on more value-added tasks that allow us to use our professional skepticism and our critical thinking. And automation's here to stay, whether it's RPA or AI or whatever's next on the horizon. We got to be ready for it, and we got to make sure our organizations are ready for it by identifying and managing those risks. So I appreciate your time together. We've got, I think, just a few minutes left. Apologize for the tech delays at the beginning, but if you have any questions, share them here, or you've got my email address there on the last slide. I'm happy to continue this conversation with anybody who might be interested. But thank you so much for spending your hour with me today on this beautiful Friday afternoon.
Hi, Andrea. Thank you. I'm glad you had positive news and the robots aren't coming for us. You know, sometimes I worry about anytime I use ChatGPT, if I'm either making myself dumber or just shooting myself in the foot. So it's great that you had good news. And I really like the examples you had from your class. I might steal some of those or come back to you in the future if I'm teaching a class like that. I think this was really helpful, and this was a great way to end our webinar series for spring 2025. And hopefully you can join us again in the future. And everyone listening, thank you for joining us on this, as Andrea said, lovely Friday afternoon. And join us back in the fall. We will have an updated slate of webinars that are hopefully interesting to you. And thank you for joining us. We're really delighted to see all the participation with getting over 800 people signing up for these webinars. It is just fantastic. So thank you again. And I hope you have a lovely Friday.
Thank you.